Yeah, cool.
Okay,
Great.
yeah.
All right. Let's get started here.
Yep.
So let's start off. What's behind? What's the problem? What's the driver that causes so many of us to want to pull off a convention of states? We're a nationwide project. There's 5 million of us in total around the nation. We're the largest grassroots organization in the country, as I understand it. We're nonpartisan. Shea and I have to behave very nonpartisan as we do this. We can't support Republicans or Democrats or individual politicians. We have to take this right down the middle. So as we do this and as we look at what's going on, we look at it from the point of view of the government as a whole, right? We don't pick on, we don't bother to worry about specific individuals and what they might do or what they might not do. You have to look at this, as Dr. Deming would say, frankly, you have to look at this as a system, a process, and you can do that. You can look at it in that way. And once you start to do that, I think you begin to understand what the real problem is. So, as you see here, there's 3 categories where things have kind of gone off the rails. The debt and the spending is out of control. The government is reaching into our personal lives way more than it's supposed to. And you've got people who are working in government way too long. When they start to do that, you get into all these sidebar issues of they've been there so long, they retire as multimillionaires. That was never what our framers intended. So any thoughts, Shea?
No, those are good. I mean, you could have a lot more topics to talk about, but the nice part about the Convention of States is that we've focused on those 3, and
right.
Every one of the 19 states that have agreed to the Convention of State principle have agreed to those same 3 tenets.
Right.
So, and every time we ask another state to vote yes for Convention of States, to ask for a convention, we're asking for them to do the same 3 items. So let's have a convention that talks about some way to control debt, some way to maybe do term limits, or how do you stop the overreach of the federal government? It's always those 3 things that we're talking about. So it's really a beautiful grassroots effort.
Yep, it sure is. Okay, so if you begin to look at the financial side of things, very quickly, when you look at a chart like this, you can see that the spending is not specific to any one party or administration. You can maybe get away with the Nixon, Ford, and even Carter era as not contributing so much to the debt. But after that, it began to accelerate and go up. And it just, again, it doesn't matter, Republican or Democrat, this is a systemic problem. The government has just gone out of control. It doesn't know how to budget. It doesn't know how to stay within boundaries when it comes to finances and money. I was reading something the other day, when they set a budget, a federal budget, I'm used to, and you probably are too, Shea, you start with a zero-based budget, and then you build it from there, right? I'm sure you did that when you were working.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, so the federal government doesn't do that. The federal government takes the numbers as projected from last year, and that's where they start. And then they just add to it.
Yeah.
So pretty quick, you can begin to see why this chart is beginning to look as bad as it does.
Right, exactly.
So
and by the way, that chart should really reflect 36.22.
Yes.
Right.
Yep, it
trillion.
should. Yep, it's
because that's where we are today.
Yep, it's about 10 off. So you're right. It's not current. But again, the whole point here is
it keeps growing.
It keeps growing in spite of who's in the presidential office, right?
Well, and you can understand that. I mean,
Sure.
I'm in the Congress, and it's easier to just agree to spending more money in that particular area. Every bureaucracy comes in with wonderful programs, if we just had a few more dollars, we could do X, Y, and
Yeah.
Z. And so, yes, we all agree and we spend all the money. But no one looks at the bottom line to the whole thing to say, hey, how are we paying for all this?
Yeah, right. I'm pretty comfortable saying that there's no accountability here.
Right, exactly.
I mean, they put these numbers together, and as we've over time we've been able to see, and you've done it with your fritter stuff, right?
Right.
You've uncovered and exposed a number of very foolish ways we spend our money in the federal government.
Right. Yep.
All right. So
Crazy.
if you begin to look at, and this is a disturbing chart for me. You look at the mandatory piece of this, and for folks who may not know it or maybe don't want to read the words at the top, that mandatory spending are things like Medicare, Medicaid, defense. Those are fixed costs that we have to account for and cover as a part of the national budget, or whatever it is you want to call it. So 61% of it is fixed. You're going to pay that no matter what. So you've got to have enough revenue coming in to cover that portion of it. Okay, that's the mandatory spending is just under $3 trillion. So you've got to, at least to begin with, your starting point is you got to take in $3 trillion. Okay, just to do that. Well, now you add in the discretionary piece of it, and that's $1.5 trillion. And then the one that is of concern here is the interest on our debt. And it just baffles me no end. All they talk about is paying the interest. You don't hear any discussion like we would have to do paying on the principal.
Right.
Okay. All they do is they pay down the interest, and that's at 8%, and it's probably higher than that now. This is not.
Do you want to take a guess of what the actual out-of-pocket expense is and interest today?
Percent wise?
No, it's $952 billion.
Is it
$952 billion?
All right. So it's approaching $1 trillion on its own.
Exactly, and that's really scary, because now where is that going to come from?
Well, and that's right. Then it's the age-old argument. Taxes or no taxes. Cut interest, cut this to do it, grow the economy and bring in money that way. There's all kinds of arguments on how you generate more revenue. It's interesting to me. All through the prior administration, I'll say it, the Trump tax cuts were still in effect, and so through those tax cuts, we were able to bring in near record levels of revenue with that approach, but it still was not enough. They still spent more than they were taking in, and that's really what this boils down to is. The government does not know how to spend within its means. It does not know how to create a budget and stay within it. All right. This is another look at the financial side of spending and what's going on. There's been maybe two times in our history. The World War II was one where the federal debt skyrocketed. This chart is a chart that shows the debt and its relative and how it's relative to what's called our gross domestic product. The gross domestic product is the value of all of the goods and services that this country produces. So you can see here, during World War II, we went into debt to the point where we were in debt, and it covered or exposed itself to where we were spending 100% of what our gross domestic product was capable of producing. But it came down, as you can see, that we worked at it as a government. So it's possible to do this, but it takes a great deal of courage and discipline to bring that down where it did around 1980. And then it began to climb up after that. The pandemic was a big shot, and it's projected by 2050 that we'll be in debt to the tune of 200% of all the goods and services this country produces. And that's just, you hear financial expert one after the other, they continue to say that's unsustainable.
Right.
And it truly is. You can't keep up this level of spending going forward like this, where it's going to cause more trouble. It's going to do all kinds of things to this country financially. The dollar value will be affected. The ability, our credit rating could be affected if we can't meet our payments. So again, it's you have to look at this certainly on a macro scale, but it doesn't paint a pretty picture here at all, does it, Shea?
No, interesting. After World War II, a number of the rules that were put in place, or the spending that was put in place for World War II, had sunsets on them, i.e., they had automatic declines or stopping points. Since the pandemic, we haven't done any of that.
Right.
All of it is just like you said, Chet, it's incremental. So we take whatever it was last year, we add to it more, and we add to it, and we add to it. And that's where this chart takes you.
Yep.
So we've, as convention states, let's assume we're at the dotted line. What we got to do is find a way to ratchet some of that spending back down again.
Yep.
Kind of the way we did after World War II.
Yep.
So we've got to sunset some costs.
That's a really great connection, Shea.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So let me see if we can get this. This is going to show you the difference between what Congress actually passes in law and the president signs versus what the unelected bureaucracy puts out in the way of rules and regulations. So the first one will go pretty quick because it's not much, but the second one will take a little longer. So take a look at this. There's no sound here. When I first saw this, it just absolutely blew my mind. And this is over a given span of time. It's probably like a year, I suppose, is what it is. In a year's time, the unelecteds promote and put out this much in the way of paperwork for rules and regulations. It's just astounding to me that we've got this kind of thing going on. And again, it's an issue of, the unelected bureaucracy. They're not held accountable to this stuff.
Right. So that chart's a great one. I hadn't seen that before, but every year about 80,000 pages of new regulations are added, to the point where we have 190,000 pages in the Code of Federal Regulations. 50 chapters worth, 190,000 pages.
Yep.
Describing the rules and regulations that we have to follow.
Yep.
And each year you're adding a whole series of additional regulations and more paper, as Chet's diagram shows pretty clearly.
Yeah, it's absolutely amazing. The first bullet here, it says, the average American probably doesn't realize I don't think we know that it's 3 felonies per day, but we are all breaking the law to some extent every day because of all of the rules and regulations that have been produced and are buried deep in this book that you're talking about, Shea.
Yeah.
The original Constitution is what, 4,000 words, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you go from 4,000 words to thousands of pages
yeah. Nobody saw this coming.
No, well, the framers certainly didn't see it. This is way beyond what they expected, what they wanted to have happen. And what it does is it just contributes to an out of control condition here. Again, this is all being done with very little oversight. The other problem we have in this country, in our federal government, is, we got a lot of people working in Washington, D.C. that are there far too long. I worked for 36 years in my job. I don't know how long you worked, Shea, but I
still working.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, for me, 36 years was too long, but different situation. I was ready to retire at the end of 36 years. You got some of these folks who are going much longer than that. The issue, the law, it's a fine balance between working too long and not there long enough, right?
Right, exactly.
You know, if you put people in office and they only work for 6 years, that's probably not going to be long enough. You know, they're not able to learn the ropes, so to speak, in that amount of time. So when you start talking about, as we will, things like term limits, there's a balance there between what's enough and what's not enough. But you know, the track record here is the longer they're there, the more they use our money to enrich themselves. Okay. So that's something that we need to address. And this is one of the things that an Article 5 Convention of States is intended to address. It's interesting when you go around the country, term limits is pretty broadly accepted and approved of as a one way of addressing what's going on in Congress. There's a sheet that we had yesterday in Lansing. There's a whole host of Article 5 conventions that have been called for on different subjects, you know, not nationwide like what we're doing, but the vast majority of those are conventions of states for term limits. We're not the only one working on term limits. We're the only one, though, working on the 3 items. But, you know, people really are supportive of it to a high level, imposing term limits on our elected officials. And I think it doesn't stop there, right, Shea?
No, but we have some experience in Michigan with term limits.
Yep.
And in fact, we just had a constitutional amendment or some change in the way the term limits are defined in Michigan. But at least we know that the legislature is there for a specific purpose, and then they're supposed to get out. So we understand how that process can work. We have to make some adjustments to it. Fine. We can do that.
Yeah.
And we have. But that's really the whole idea.
Yep. Well, our framers, you know, when you know, and you know, we aren't going to be able to function as they did. They were largely farmers and tradesmen, craftsmen types, but you know, they expected to come in, serve their time, which was not long, and then go back to their job. You know, so
right.
Yeah, we aren't living in that age anymore. But I don't think that they would be shocked today to see what some of these folks are doing. Okay. So as you begin to look at the bigger problem here, and that to me is the most logical way to do this. This is something that's more than a political party, more than a politician or office holder as individuals. This is about the system of government, okay? The system of government has just grown way beyond what is necessary for the good of the country. You know, we've got the 3 branches, the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. 2 of them for sure have grown way bigger than they should. You know, if you look at the executive branch alone, and you know, it depends on how you count heads, but there's at least 4 million people, and by some counts, when you start bringing in the NGOs and the contractors, you know, the executive branch hires about 10 million people. That alone should tell you something about the growth of government and what it can do. I don't know about where you work, but the company I work for was a large company, and it was not too hard to be able to see the waste that went on. I don't say there was fraud where I worked, but there was a lot of waste and inefficiency just because it was so big.
Yep.
You know, there's just no way, you know, from the top guy to the bottom gal, you know, that you can be efficient in workflow and getting work activities and things done, you know, spending money wisely. It's just, the bigger the organization, the more chance there is for waste and inefficiency. You know, by comparison, the legislative and judicial branches, you know, they're just a little over 30,000 people. Those haven't changed a lot, you know, as compared to what the executive branch has grown into being. But I think today, I'm pretty sure this is right, but the United States government is the largest employer in this country, if not in the world.
Pretty upsetting, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, it's just, you don't have to even worry about digging in to find fraud and abuse. It's just the inefficiencies that come with something so large. And Deming, Dr. Deming would have, I'm sure, a lot to say about something like this. That's just it's grown way beyond its ability to function. Truthfully.
Yep.